You might think I'm dressed a little bit unusual today, but it's baseball season, or will be in a few days, uh, so I'm dressed appropriately for that. Okay. Um, we've been dealing with the elements of the short story all the way along now, and you folks have done a great job. You have made some great comments in your essays, um, and in your comments, you know, and it's obvious that for pretty much everybody, you've realized that the more you know about the makeup of fiction, the more you can enjoy it. And that's what we've been aiming for all semester. So, some of you may think that we've gone a little bit slow. Some of you may think we've done an awful lot. Well, I think we've done a good deal, but I also think that you've demonstrated to me that over and over again, you've learned a lot. Okay. Um, I think that what you're writing in your essays and what you're writing in your comments has indicated to me that you've learned an awful lot about fiction, that fiction is more than just something that you read through and be done with it. You know, um, hopefully you've gotten the idea, and I'm sure from your essays, you've gotten the idea that when you read a piece of fiction, there's all of these things that make it up, and all of those make it better, stronger, more enjoyable. So, we just wrote about symbolism, okay? And, by looking at the symbols in Young Goodman Brown, you can see exactly where Hawthorne is going with all of this. And you can see why he uses all these symbols. It draws you more and more and more into the mindset that he's trying to give you and into the theme that he's trying to create there, okay? And into the overall meaning that he's trying to put forth for you. Hawthorne, again, had this feeling, that belief that the Puritans were a very hypocritical culture. They tried to create the idea that they were holier than thou. And so, he puts them in kind of like the worst of all possible scenario. But he sets it at the time of the witchcraft trials, when there were people who were admitting they were witches. Now, what does that mean? That means that they were devil worshippers. Okay? So these people who came here so they could practice their religion had gone off track, and some of them had gone off track a lot. The role of religion had faded so much when it was such an important thing in their world. Okay, but we talked about that before. So anyway, looking at the symbols shows you all of that, and Hawthorne chose those symbols darn carefully. Hawthorne chooses every word that he uses darn carefully. Okay, so and a couple of you wrote about the fact that the ribbons in Pink's hair, in Faith's hair, were pink. Pink is a combination of white, meaning innocence, and red, meaning sensuality, evil. We often see the devil as red, okay? Um, and somebody even said when Faith lost her ribbons and they came floating down to Goodman Brown, it was really a symbol that she had lost all innocence. And I guess that's pretty true, because she's on her way to a witch's Sabbath, isn't she? Okay, so you people did a great job with that. Anyway, so now it's time for us to move on from the short story. Okay, I think you've really done a great job with the short story, and now it's time for us to move on. And we're going on to, yes, don't be afraid, we're going on to poetry. There's nothing for you to be afraid of in poetry. Our approach to poetry is going to be similar to the approach we took with the short story, with the sense that we want you to come to enjoy poetry more than you do now. Now, some people hate poetry, okay? Some people love poetry. Some people are kind of like, they don't really have feelings either way about it. They're pretty neutral. We want you to not be afraid of poetry And we want you to be willing to see poetry as an experience and a way of learning something. So, the first kind of poetry we're going to look at this week is narrative poetry. Okay? Narrative poetry. Now, narrative, story. Narrative poetry tells us a story. Okay? In general, it's not this deep emotional stuff. It might be, but in general, it's not. It is telling us a story. Reading poetry does not have to be a terribly difficult thing. Here's a key to reading poetry. When you read poetry, read it by the punctuation. Don't just read it line by line, because then too often you get into a sing-songy thing and you may well lose track of what's said line by line, because the rhymes get to be the things that stand out so much. The power of poetry really is that it takes ideas and says them in very few words, and words that can explode into meaning, words that are like popcorn kernels and just explode and do so much more. Okay, so reading poetry by the punctuation will help you appreciate that. So again, try to break the habit of reading poetry line by line or rhyme by rhyme. And do things have to rhyme to be poems? I don't think so, right? Absolutely not. However, most of the poems that you've dealt with and most of the poems that we'll deal with now are poems that rhyme, okay? So we're going to do poems that tell a story, and you probably have guessed that there really is a reason for me wearing this besides the fact that it's the beginning of baseball season. I want to share with you one of my favorite poems, okay? And the name of that poem is Casey at the Bat. Obviously, it's a baseball story, okay? And the poem goes like this. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2 with but one inning more to play. And so when Cooney died at first and Burroughs did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to the hope that springs eternal in the human breast. They thought, if only Casey could but get a whack at that, they'd put up even money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a pudding, and the latter was a fake. So upon this stricken multitude, grim melancholy sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single, to the wonderment of all, and Blake, the much despised, tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted and they saw what had occurred, there was Jimmy safe on second and Flynn a hugging third. Then from this joyous multitude up a gladdened yell. It bounded from the mountain top and rattled in the dell. It struck upon the hillside and recoiled upon the flat, for Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearings and a smile on Casey's face. And when responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat. No stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the wreathing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance gleamed in Casey's eye. A sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by that sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. That ain't my style, said Casey. Strike one, the umpire said. From the benches black with people, there went up a muffled roar like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. Kill him, kill the umpire, shouted someone on the stand, and it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visit shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to that pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew. But Casey still ignored it. The umpire said, strike two! Fraud! Cried the maddened thousands, and the echo answered, fraud! But a scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey would not let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lips. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go. And now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. Okay, so that's a poem that I just love because I'm a baseball guy. Yeah, I'm a runner, sure you know that, but I'm a baseball guy too, and I coached baseball for 26 years, and I played it for an awful lot of years, and I'm just a baseball guy, so I love that poem, and I love the drama in it. And I love the human emotion that's part of it. I mean, if you're a sports person at all, you can't help but feel the emotion in that poem, But it tells us a story, and it tells us a pretty neat story of a guy that maybe is a little bit too arrogant for his own good, and so ultimately, he Casey strikes out. Okay, so and many of you may have played some baseball in your time, okay, or some softball, and so you can really understand. Or many of you have kids, and you may have kids that play baseball, so you know a little bit of what goes on, and you know how hard people try. Okay, that's what I love about this poem. It's just so human, so much human emotion, so much feeling, so much power goes into it all. And that's part of what poetry can do for you, besides the fact that a narrative poem tells us a story, okay? And that's what this poem does. I have another narrative poem that I want to share with you, and it's called The Cremation of Sam McGee. Actually, I have a third poem, and I'm not going to recite this third poem for you because most of you probably know it by heart. But the third poem is The Night Before Christmas. Yes, The Night Before Christmas is a narrative poem. It is a piece of poetry, and it tells us a story. And we all know that poem. We may never have thought about it as poetry, but The Night Before Christmas is poetry, okay? So all of you already know a narrative poem. And in this week's assignment, if you want to write about The Night Before Christmas as one of the poems you write about, that's okay, because here I am bringing it up to you, okay? We've already talked about Casey at the bat, and that's one of my favorites. But this is another poem that I like an awful lot. And when I'm really on, I can go through the whole thing by memory. I'm not sure, so I have it here in front of me just in case, okay? Now, this poem is set in the Yukon, in the north, miserable, cold Alaska and Canada, where it gets to be 75 degrees below zero, and we know about the Yukon gold rush up there in the 1890s, 2000, around there, and how people went there to try to get gold. Well, that's what this poem is all about, okay? And the poem goes like this, and again, I'll try it in my head, and if I blow it, well, I have my sheet in front of me. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake LaBarge I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home down the south to roam around the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell. But he'd often say in his homely way that he'd sooner live in hell. On a Christmas day, we were mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold! Through the parka's fold it stabbed like a driven nail. If our eyes we'd close and the lashes froze, till sometimes we couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. And that very night, as we lay packed tight in our robes beneath the snow, and the dogs were fed and the stars overhead were dancing heel and toe, he turned to me and, "Cap," says he, "I'll cash in this trip, I guess." And if I do, I'm asking that you won't refuse my last request. Well, he seems so low that I couldn't say no. Then he says with a sort of moan, "It's the cursed cold, and it's got right hold till I'm chilled clear through to the bone. Yet tain't being dead. It's the awful dread of an icy grave that pains. So I want you to swear that foul or fair, you'll create my last remains." Well, a pale's last need is a thing to heed, and I swore I would not fail. And we started on at the break of dawn, but God, he looked ghastly pale. He sat in the sleigh and he raved all day of his home in Tennessee. And before nightfall, a corpse was all that was left of Sam McGee. There wasn't a breath in this land of death as I hurried horror-driven, with a corpse half hid that I couldn't get rid because of a promise I'd given. It was lashed to the sleigh, but it seemed to say, "You may tax your brawn and brain, but you promised true. Now it's up to you to cremate these last remains." Now, a promise made is a debt unpaid, and the trail has its own stern cold. In the days to come, though my lips were numb, in my heart how I cursed that load. In the long, long night, by the lone firelight, where the huskies, round in a ring, howled out their woes to the nameless foes. Oh God, how I loathed that thing. But on we went, though the trail was spent and the grub was getting low. I think I just blew it. Let me check. Okay. Yep. And I went, though the dogs were bent and the grub was getting low. The trail was bad, and I felt half mad, but I swore I would not give in. And I'd often sing to that hateful thing, and it hearkened with a grin, till I came to the marge of Lake Lebarge, and a derelict there lay. A derelict isn't an old ship. Okay. It was jammed in the ice, but I saw in a trice it was called the Alice May. I looked at it, and I thought a bit, and I looked at my frozen chum. "Now here," said I, with a sudden cry, "is my crematorium." Some planks I tore from the cabin floor, and I lit the boiler fire. Some coal I found that was lying around, and I heaped the furnace higher. The flames just soared, and the furnace roared, such a blaze you seldom see. Then I burrowed a hole in the glowing coal, and I stuffed in Sam McGee. Then I made a hike, for I didn't like to hear him sizzle so, and the heavens howled, and the huskies growled, and the wind began to blow. It was cold as ice, but the hot sweat ran down my cheeks, and I don't know why. And an inky smoke and a greasy cloak went streaking down the sky. I do not know how long in the snow I wrestled with grisly fear, but the stars came out, and I danced about ere again I ventured near. I was sick with dread, but I bravely said, "Guess I'll take a peep inside. I guess he's cooked, and it's time I looked." Then the door I opened wide, and there sat Sam, looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar. And he wore a smile you could see a mile, and he said, "Please close that door. It's warm in here, but I gravely fear you'll let in the cold and storm. Since I left Plumtree down in Tennessee, it's the first time I've been warm." There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest I ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Lebarge. I cremated Sam McGee. Okay, so that's another narrative poem. Narrative poems tell us a story, okay? And again, I'm going to assign you certain poems and give you your choice of ones to write about. But when you read the poems, try to break the habit of reading them line by line, and try as best you can to read them by the punctuation, because it'll make a lot more sense there. It's the way you read stories. You don't read a piece of prose, a short story, line by line. Try not to read a poem that way either, and then it can make a whole lot more sense. Now again, we're going to be reading poems that are considered narrative poems. They are poems that tell us a story. Does that mean that they won't move us emotionally? Not necessarily. I already told you how much Casey at the Bat moves me and so many of its hearers, listeners, readers emotionally. So, you might be moved emotionally by any any narrative poem you read. Okay, but this week we're dealing with narrative poems. Now, question for you, video question for you for the week. Tell me, what did Casey do when he was up to bed? Okay? Simple answer. Tell me what Casey did when he was up to bed. Now, you guys have a good week or two, okay? The due date will be down there with the assignment, okay? And we will talk to you all again soon. Questions, you know where to get me. You have my cell, you have my text, you have my email. So, if you need to get in touch with me, I'm here for you. You're doing great. Have a good week.